Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
It may be one of the world's greatest mysteries. Who exactly was Jack the Ripper?
In the early hours of September 30th, 1888, a City of London police constable named Edward Watkins makes his rounds through Mitre Square, a small enclosed courtyard in the heart of Whitechapel, the poorest and most dangerous neighborhood in Victorian London. At 1:30 a.m., the courtyard is empty. At 1:44 a.m., Watkins passes through again. On the ground is a body. Catherine Eddowes, age 46, lies on her back with her throat cut from ear to ear. Her abdomen is torn open. Her intestines have been pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and uterus are missing. Her face has been mutilated with deliberate, symmetrical cuts beneath the eyes, as if the killer had drawn something on her face. 14 minutes. The killer did all of this in 14 minutes, in total darkness, with no lighting, with police officers patrolling less than 100 yards away, and vanished without a trace. 3 weeks later, a package arrives at the office of the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside is half a human kidney preserved in alcohol and a note written in shaky handwriting. From hell, Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. I preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. For 136 years, the identity of Jack the Ripper has been the most debated criminal mystery in history. More than 100 suspects, thousands of books, hundreds of theories, zero resolution. Until February 2025, when a forensic DNA analysis published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences revealed the killer's identity with what the investigators call a 100% genetic match. And the name behind Jack the Ripper is exactly the one Victorian police suspected from the very beginning, but could never prove. To understand what DNA and AI just confirmed, you have to go back to the autumn of 1888 and the most infamous neighborhood in the history of crime. Whitechapel was hell on earth, 1 square mile of misery in the East End of London, where 80,000 people lived packed into conditions that would today be considered uninhabitable. Tenement houses called doss houses, where 15 people slept in a single room for 4p a night. Streets so narrow 2 people could barely pass. No sewer system. No running water in most buildings. No lighting after dark. The gaslight only reached the main thoroughfares, and the alleys and courtyards where most people lived were pitch black after sunset. Prostitution was not a choice, but the only means of survival for thousands of women who had no employment, no family support, and no way out. There were an estimated 200 prostitutes working in Whitechapel in 1888. Alcohol was the only refuge from cold, hunger, and despair, and most of the victims were found with alcohol in their systems. Between August 31 and November 9 of 1888, 5 women were murdered in this neighborhood with a brutality Victorian London had never witnessed. The police called them the Canonical Five. Mary Ann Nichols, 43, was found at 3:40 a.m. on August 31 on Bucks Row with her throat cut to the spine and deep, jagged incisions to her abdomen. She was the first confirmed victim. Annie Chapman, 47, was found at 6 a.m. on September 8 in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat was cut, her abdomen was entirely opened, and her uterus had been removed. The coroner noted that the organ removal showed a degree of surgical skill, or at minimum familiarity with anatomy, that was unusual for a random act of violence. Elizabeth Stride, 44, was found at 1 a.m. on September 30 with her throat slashed but no abdominal mutilations. Most researchers believe the killer was interrupted, possibly by the arrival of Louis Diemschutz, whose horse shied away from the body as he drove his cart into Dutfield's yard. Catherine Eddowes, 46, was found just 45 minutes after Stride at 1:44 a.m. in Mitre Square, barely half a mile away. Her throat was cut, her face was mutilated, her abdomen was opened, and her left kidney and uterus were removed. The killer had struck twice in one night, what the press would call the double event, and Mary Jane Kelly, 25, the youngest and last victim, was found at 10:45 a.m. on November 9 in her rented room at 13 Miller's Court. What the killer did to Kelly is beyond what most people can comprehend. She was found on her bed, virtually skinned. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition. Her abdominal organs had been removed and placed around the room, on the table, on the bed, beneath her head. The heart was missing entirely and was never found. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was not just killing, it was obliteration. And it was the last one. So after Kelly, the murders stopped. The press of the era went into a frenzy that has never been matched before or since. The name Jack the Ripper was coined by a letter, almost certainly a hoax, written by a journalist, sent to the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. But the name stuck. It became the most famous alias in criminal history. The city descended into panic. Women stopped going out at night. Citizen vigilance committees were formed. Queen Victoria herself sent a telegram demanding action. Scotland Yard brought in its best detectives, including Inspector Frederick Eberline, who would spend years hunting the Ripper without success. Police mounted the largest operation in their history, with plainclothes officers patrolling every street and alley of Whitechapel after dark, and none of it worked. The murders stopped as abruptly as they started, and the killer was never caught. Over 100 suspects have been named over the years, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, the painter Walter Sickert, the author Lewis Carroll, a midwife, a Russian spy, a Jewish ritual slaughterman. The theories are endless, and for 136 years, every single one of them has been unprovable. But the Victorian police had their own list, and at the top of it was a name they kept coming back to. The police had suspects, many of them, but 3 stood out above all others. 3 names that the head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department, Melville Macnaghten, mentioned in a confidential memorandum in 1894. Montague John Druitt, a lawyer who committed suicide shortly after the last murder. Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man. And Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish barber who lived in Whitechapel and was committed to an asylum in 1891. Kosminski was always the police's favorite. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the investigation, wrote in the marginal notes of his memoirs that Kosminski had been positively identified by a witness who saw him with one of the victims shortly before the murder. But the witness, also Jewish, refused to formally testify against a member of his own community. Without formal testimony, there was no case. Kosminski was committed to the Levsden Asylum, where he remained until his death in 1919. And there it ended, for 136 years. In 2007, a businessman and amateur historian named Russell Edwards did something impulsive. At an auction of Victorian artifacts, he purchased a silk shawl allegedly found next to Catherine Eddowes' body on the night of her murder. The shawl had been kept by Police Sergeant Amos Simpson, who took it from the crime scene and brought it home as a keepsake, a practice that would be inconceivable today but was relatively common in 1888. The shawl was passed down through the Simpson family for generations and eventually ended up at an auction where Edwards bought it for an amount he has never disclosed. Edwards knew that if the shawl was authentic, it might contain biological evidence over a century old. But finding someone willing to work on it was harder than he expected. Most forensic labs dismissed the idea. The shawl was too old, too contaminated, too handled. The chances of extracting usable DNA from a piece of silk that had been sitting in closets and drawers for 12 decades were, to put it politely, slim. He finally found his scientist, Dr. Jerry Luolainen, a Finnish biochemist specializing in molecular biology at Liverpool John Moores University, was exactly the kind of researcher who would take on a case everyone else thought was hopeless. Luolainen had experience in forensic genetics and cold case analysis. He understood the limitations, and he accepted the challenge. What followed was a forensic analysis process that took years. Years of painstaking, meticulous work in a lab environment that had to be kept sterile enough to avoid introducing modern DNA into a Victorian crime scene artifact. Luolainen's first step was to examine the shawl under UV light. Ultraviolet reveals biological stains that are invisible to the naked eye. Body fluids that have dried and darkened over time but still fluoresce when hit with the right wavelength. What he found under the UV lamp was significant. 2 distinct types of stains on different areas of the shawl. The first type were blood stains. They were distributed across the fabric in a spray pattern consistent with arterial spattering, the specific pattern produced when a sharp blade severs a carotid artery, the major blood vessel in the neck. Arterial blood is under pressure. When the artery is cut, the blood sprays outward in a fine mist. The pattern on the shawl was consistent with someone standing close to a victim whose throat had just been slashed, exactly what happened to Catherine Eddowes. The second type were semen stains located in a different area of the shawl, away from the blood spray. The implication was clear. Whoever left the semen on the shawl was at the crime scene, and the sexual nature of the stain aligned with the known profile of the Ripper, whose crimes had an unmistakable sexual component. The mutilation of reproductive organs, the posing of the bodies, the increasing intimacy of the violence culminating in the destruction of Mary Jane Kelly. The DNA from the bloodstains was extracted using protocols designed specifically for degraded samples. Luolainen used mitochondrial DNA analysis, mtDNA, which has a major advantage over nuclear DNA when dealing with ancient or degraded samples. Mitochondria exist in hundreds of copies per cell compared to just 1 copy of nuclear DNA. That means even when a sample has been degraded by a century of exposure, there is a much higher chance of recovering usable mitochondrial sequences. Luolainen contacted living maternal line descendants of Catherine Eddowes. He obtained their DNA samples, and he compared The blood DNA from the shawl matched the victim's descendants. The shawl was present at Eddowes' murder. The first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But what really mattered, what would make or break the entire investigation, were the semen stains. If the killer had left biological fluids on the shawl, the DNA from those stains would be Jack the Ripper's DNA, his genetic signature. A biological fingerprint left 120 years before anyone knew what DNA was. Llewellyn extracted the DNA from the semen stains. He sequenced it. And then he needed a comparison. He contacted genealogical researchers who helped him identify and locate living maternal line descendants of Aaron Kosminski. The semen DNA matched Kosminski's descendants, both the victim's blood and the suspect's semen, on the same shawl at the same crime scene. The probability of both matches being coincidental is, according to the researchers, vanishingly small. Not impossible, the skeptics will make sure to point that out, but so improbable that it would require an extraordinary chain of contamination events to explain away. Edwards published the preliminary results in 2014 in a book titled Naming Jack the Ripper. The scientific community and the ripperology community, because yes, there is an academic community devoted exclusively to Jack the Ripper, reacted with skepticism. The main criticisms were possible contamination of the shawl after 120 years of family handling, the reliability of mitochondrial DNA for individual identification, and the lack of publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Llewellyn listened. And together with Dr. David Miller of the University of Leeds, he spent the following years refining the analysis. In March 2019, they published their results in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, one of the most respected forensic journals in the world. The results confirmed the DNA match for both the victim and Kosminski. And in February 2025, the final blow landed. A new analysis using state-of-the-art DNA sequencing techniques and AI-assisted genomic analysis tools, capable of reconstructing partial genetic profiles from samples degraded by more than a century of oxidation, confirmed the results with what the researchers described as a 100% match on the analyzed markers. The AI also determined that the owner of the semen DNA had brown hair and brown eyes, details matching the description from the witness who identified Kosminski near the crime scene. Aaron Mordecai Kosminski was born in 1865 in Klodawa, a small town in the Kalisz Governorate of Congress, Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. His father, Abram Józef Kosminski, was a tailor. When Aaron was about 8 years old, his father died. His mother, Golda, was left to raise the children alone in a country that was actively persecuting its Jewish population through systematic pogroms. States sanctioned massacres that destroyed villages, burned homes, and murdered thousands. The Kosminski family fled. They arrived in England in 1882, part of the massive wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration that transformed the East End of London between 1880 and 1914. They settled in Whitechapel, the only neighborhood where a penniless immigrant family with no English could survive, where Yiddish was spoken on every corner, where the synagogues and kosher butchers and sweatshops of the Jewish community provided a fragile safety net against the hostility of the English working class. Aaron found work as a barber. In the sweatshops and barber shops of Whitechapel, a barber used razors, scissors, and straight blades every day. He sharpened them himself. He understood edges. He understood how a blade moves through skin. And while a barber is not a surgeon, the anatomical knowledge required to remove a kidney or a uterus in near total darkness in under 15 minutes is not surgical knowledge. It is practical knowledge. It is knowing where the organs sit. It is knowing how deep to cut. It is knowing what to pull. A butcher would know. A barber who also worked in a slaughterhouse, and many Whitechapel immigrants would know. Kosminski's mental health deteriorated throughout the 1880s. By the time of the murders, he was exhibiting signs of what Victorian psychiatrists described as insanity, and what modern clinicians would almost certainly diagnose as paranoid schizophrenia. He heard voices. He believed people were trying to poison his food. He refused to eat anything he had not picked up from the ground himself. He did not wash. He talked to himself constantly, sometimes shouting at invisible figures. And he had sexual compulsions that led him to masturbate in public, a behavior that his family found increasingly impossible to manage. Records from the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, where he was committed in February 1891, document all of this in clinical detail. They also record that on at least one occasion before his committal, he threatened his sister with a knife. The note in his admission file reads, "He has threatened his sister with a knife." The timeline is critical. The Ripper murders took place between August and November 1888. Kosminski was committed in February 1891, roughly 2.5 years after the last murder. During those 2.5 years, there were no more Ripper-style killings in Whitechapel. The murders stopped exactly When Kosminski's mental state deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function in the community, when his family could no longer control him, when his behavior became so erratic that institutionalization was unavoidable. The most damning piece of Victorian evidence comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the officer who ran the day-to-day investigation. In his personal copy of Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson's memoirs, published in 1910, Swanson wrote marginal notes that were not discovered until after his death. In those notes, known today as the Swanson Marginalia, he identified the suspect Anderson had publicly referred to as a Polish Jew without naming. Swanson wrote, Kosminski was the suspect. He described how Kosminski was taken to the Seaside Home, a police convalescent facility in Brighton, for an identification parade. A witness, described only as a fellow Jewish man, identified Kosminski as the man he had seen with a victim shortly before a murder. But the witness refused to testify formally. According to Swanson, the suspect was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch and died shortly afterwards. The last detail is wrong. Kosminski lived until 1919, but the identification is clear. The police knew. They could not prove it in court. But they knew. Kosminski died in the Leavesden Asylum on March 24, 1919, of gangrene in his leg. He was 53 years old. He had been locked away for 28 years. He was never formally charged with the Whitechapel murders. He was never tried. He never confessed. And the public never learned his name until decades after his death, when researchers began piecing together the fragments of Scotland Yard's confidential files. It would not be a Jack the Ripper case without debate. The Ripperology community is one of the most passionate, obsessive, and contentious groups of amateur and professional researchers in the world. They have been arguing about this case for over a century. And the DNA evidence, predictably, has not ended the argument. It has intensified it. The skeptics have legitimate arguments, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The first and most damaging criticism is the chain of custody. The shawl spent 120 years in the Simpson family's possession before being auctioned. It was not stored in a sealed evidence locker. It was not kept in a climate-controlled environment. It was kept in a house, then passed to children, then to grandchildren. It was touched, folded, stored in drawers, possibly placed in cedar chests, possibly washed. Nobody knows for certain. For 120 years, every person who handled the shawl potentially deposited their own DNA on it. Every dust particle, every skin cell, every microbe in the air could have contaminated it. In a modern courtroom, any defense attorney worth their fee would tear the evidence apart on chain of custody grounds alone. The second criticism is the nature of mitochondrial DNA itself. Mitochondrial DNA is not like nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is unique to every individual on the planet. It is the gold standard of forensic identification. Mitochondrial DNA, by contrast, is shared with every person on your maternal line. Your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and every descendant of every woman in that line. That means the DNA match with Kosminski's descendants does not prove the semen belongs to Aaron, Kosminski specifically. It proves it belongs to someone on his maternal line. That could be a brother, a cousin, a nephew, or any maternal relative alive in Whitechapel in 1888. Given the density of the Eastern European Jewish community in that neighborhood, the possibility of a maternal relative living nearby is not trivial. The third criticism is the provenance of the shawl itself. There is no official police inventory that lists a silk shawl among the items found at the Catherine Eddowes murder scene. The Eddowes autopsy report lists her clothing in detail: a chintz skirt, a dark green bodice, a man's white vest, and other items, but does not mention a silk shawl. The only evidence that the shawl was at the crime scene is the family story passed down through the Simpson family, and family stories transmitted orally over 5 generations are not forensic evidence. The fourth criticism, raised by several academic researchers, is more technical. When the initial 2014 results were scrutinized, critics found what appeared to be an error in the mitochondrial DNA sequencing, a position where a relatively common genetic variant was reported as rare. If that position was miscoded, it would significantly weaken the statistical power of the match. Llewellyn and Miller addressed this in their 2019 peer-reviewed paper, using improved sequencing methods, but some critics remain unconvinced. And there is a fifth argument that is less about the science and more about the psychology of the case. Jack the Ripper has been the world's most famous unsolved murder for 136 years. An entire industry, books, tours, movies, TV shows, podcasts, walking tours of Whitechapel, a dedicated museum, academic journals, exists because the case is unsolved. If Kosminski is confirmed as the killer, that industry collapses. There is, uncomfortable as it is to say, a financial incentive for the case to remain open. And some critics have noted that the same incentive exists for Russell Edwards, who wrote a best-selling book identifying Kosminski and whose book sales benefit directly from the continued publicity of each new DNA study. But here is the counter-argument that the skeptics have struggled with. The 2025 study did not just confirm the mitochondrial DNA match. It used next-generation sequencing techniques that are orders of magnitude more precise than anything available in 2014 or even 2019. It extracted phenotypic information, physical characteristics, from the degraded DNA, and it found that the donor had brown hair and brown eyes. That matches the eyewitness description. That matches Kuzminski. And that is something a contamination argument cannot easily explain away, because contamination from modern handling would show modern DNA, not DNA consistent with a 19th century genetic profile. Karen Miller, great-granddaughter of Catherine Eddowes, summed it up in a sentence that has circulated across every British media outlet. We have the proof. Now we need an inquest to legally name the killer. She has hired lawyers to request an official investigation. If a court accepts, it would be the first time in history that a 136-year-old case is formally reopened on DNA evidence. And if the inquest rules in her favor, Aaron Kosminski will become legally and officially Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper has been, for 136 years, the most famous faceless killer in history. Not the most prolific, there have been worse. Not the most violent, the 20th century produced horrors that make Whitechapel look tame. The most famous, because he was never caught, because the darkness of Whitechapel protected him, because Victorian police, operating without fingerprinting, without DNA analysis, without cameras, without any of the tools modern detectives take for granted, did not have the technology to find a killer who operated in streets so dark you could not see your own hands. And because of the mystery, the world fell in love with the mystery. It is the mystery that sells the books, fills the walking tours, drives the documentaries. It is the mystery that has made Jack the Ripper a character, almost a fictional figure, in the public imagination. We forgot that behind the name were 5 real women with real lives, with real families, who died in unimaginable pain on the streets of a neighborhood that the richest empire on earth had decided to forget. And now a piece of silk stained with blood and semen, kept for 120 years in a family closet, analyzed with molecular technology that did not exist in the wildest dreams of 1888 detectives, and processed by an artificial intelligence capable of reconstructing genetic profiles from samples degraded by more than a century of oxidation, has said what Scotland Yard police whispered behind closed doors but could never shout in a courtroom. It was Kuzminski, Aaron Kuzminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber, a refugee from Russian persecution, schizophrenic, hearing voices, unable to feed himself normally, unable to control his impulses, who lived 200 yards from the crime scenes in the same labyrinth of dark alleys and overcrowded tenements as his victims, who was identified by a witness who saw him with one of the women, who handled sharp blades every day of his working life, who was locked in an asylum 2 years after the murders and never saw the outside world again. Not a prince, not a royal physician, not a Freemason engaged in a conspiracy to protect the crown, not a famous artist embedding clues in his paintings, not a deranged doctor performing some kind of occult ritual, none of the dramatic, theatrical theories that have filled best-selling books and Hollywood movies for over a century. The truth, as the DNA and the AI and the police files and the asylum records all converge to show, is far more mundane and far more disturbing. Jack the Ripper was a sick, poor, lonely, mentally ill immigrant living in the most forgotten slum of the world's most powerful empire. A man who was invisible not because he was clever, but because nobody in Whitechapel mattered enough for the police to look closely. A man whose psychosis drove him to commit acts of extraordinary violence in the dark, and whose community, out of loyalty, out of fear, out of a deeply ingrained distrust of the English authorities who had never protected them, closed ranks and refused to give him up. That is what the DNA says. That is what the AI confirms. And that, in a way, is the most disturbing revelation of all. Because for 136 years, the world wanted Jack the Ripper to be someone extraordinary, someone worthy of the mythology, someone whose identity, when finally revealed, would be a thunderbolt. And the truth is, he was exactly what the detectives who walked those streets and talked to those witnesses and smelled the blood on the cobblestones said he was from the very beginning. A sick man with a knife who lived on the next street over. The horror was never the mystery. The horror was the ordinariness. Subscribe. Because Jack the Ripper has just been named. But there are unidentified killers the AI is hunting right now. Cold cases sitting in evidence lockers across the world, waiting for the same technology that just closed the oldest open murder file in history. If this video kept you up, the next one will not let you sleep at all. It is on your screen.